Alabama today, proud, at peace, celebrating its place in our nation's history. Celebrating with Selma on this weekend, thousands from around the country and the President of the United States.
I thank you all for what you did here.
What they did here in the early 60s was stage a revolution, a nonviolent coup of a way of life. The right to vote was a major goal.
All you demonstrators under arrest.
And Selma was one of the battlegrounds. Joe Smitherman was first elected mayor in 1964. 36 years later, he's still the mayor.
Blacks were not allowed to vote. They might allow 1 out of 100, or maybe at times, if they felt they could control that black vote. We had around 10 or 11,000 white voters in the county, and we only had about 250 black voters.
In January 1965, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. arrived to turn up the heat. John Lewis was a young disciple of Dr. King.
Selma was a sleepy little town that had a sheriff that wore a button on his left lapel that said never. Never to voter registration, never to integration. Very mean man by the name of Jim Clark. He wore a gun on one side, a nightstick on the other side, and he carried an electric calf rod in his hand. He didn't use it on cows.
Demonstrations were greeted with mass arrests. Then that February, during one demonstration in nearby Marion, Alabama, police shot a young man named Jimmy Lee Jackson. He died 1 week later.
And because of what happened to him, we made a decision that we will march from Selma to Montgomery to dramatize to the nation, to the world, and to the state of Alabama that people wanted to register to vote.
In 1965, Browns Chapel became the epicenter of the voting rights drive that turned its focus to Selma. On this Sunday morning, people gathered to remember another Sunday not so long ago when 600 people marched out of this church and into history.
I thought we would be arrested. I really did. But when we got out there, I didn't see any paddy wagons, so I had the feeling that something was going to happen.
You got really over the little crest of the bridge, and then what did you see?
When we got over the bridge, we saw a sea of blue, Alabama State Troopers. Jose Williams said to me, he said, "John, can you swim? We saw all of this water down below in the Alabama River." I said, "No." And we continued to walk. A man identified himself and said, "I'm Major John Cloud of the Alabama State Troopers. This is an unlawful march and it will not be allowed to continue. I give you 3 minutes to disperse and return to your church."
March will not continue.
And what did you do?
We asked for a moment to kneel and pray. And before we can give word to the crowd behind, Major Cloud said, "Troopers, advance." They came toward us, beating us with nightsticks, bull whips, trampling us with horses, releasing the tear gas. I was hit in the head by state troopers with a nightstick. I thought I was going to die.
Cheyenne Webb Christberg was 7 years old in 1965. Unknown to her parents, she had joined the march and was on the bridge that bloody Sunday.
As I stood there, my heart was just beating real fast. And all of a sudden, I had started running. I could still hear the sirens and the cries of the people who were running, bleeding and falling, trying to make their way back to Browns Chapel AME Church.
2 days later, Dr. King led a second march to the foot of the Edmund Pettus Bridge. This time, with the eyes of the nation on Selma, there was a tense standoff, but no violence. One marcher came from Boston, the Reverend James Reed.
That evening, he came back and went out with a group of ministers to get something to eat. They were attacked by a group of local whites. He was beaten so severe, he died 2 or 3 days later.
An outraged President Johnson addressed a joint session of Congress and 70 million TV viewers, calling for a swift passage of a Voting Rights Act.
One of the most moving statements that any American president ever made, the whole question of civil rights. He started that speech off that night by saying, "I speak tonight for the dignity of man and for the destiny of democracy."
And the destiny of democracy. Their cause must be our cause too. Because it's not just Negroes, but really it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice.
In that speech, he said over and over
we
again,
shall
and we shall
overcome.
overcome. I was sitting next to Dr. King as we listened to President Johnson, and tears came down his face. He cried. I think we all cried over this.
March 21st, 1965, 2 weeks after Bloody Sunday, on the steps of Brown Chapel, Dr. King prepared thousands for a third attempt to march.
We are in the midst of a great struggle today.
He was my friend, my brother,
We have no
my leader, my hero. He said we all can be great because we all can serve.
4,000 strong, civil rights and religious leaders, politicians and celebrities in a line over a mile long. A Michigan man with just one leg, all joined by people from around the country, to walk the 54 miles from Selma to Montgomery, and by presidential order, under the watchful eye of the Army and National Guard. At the end, Dr. King gave a memorable speech in the shadow of the Alabama state capitol.
He spoke from his heart, from his soul, from his gut.
It will not be long because truth crushed earth will rise again. Yes, sir. How long? Not long. Yes, sir. Because no lie can live forever. Yes, sir. How long?
Not long.
long.
How long? Not long. And it was not long.
That same night, a young housewife from Detroit had volunteered to drive some of the marchers back home to Selma. Returning to Montgomery, she and a passenger were driving down this road, Highway 80, the route of the march, then just 2 lanes lined with cotton fields. In the dark of night, at this point, about halfway back to Montgomery, the peace of the last 4 days was blown apart. A carload of Klansmen pulled alongside Viola Liuzzo's speeding car. She was shot and killed, the lone casualty of the march. Less than 4 months later, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act.
I feel like I'm walking on special ground, on hallowed and sacred ground.
And voting is a powerful right of democracy, isn't it?
You have to use the vote. And what convinced me long ago that the vote was so powerful is people fought so hard to keep us from using it.
For today, Rahima Ellis.